If, like me, you've decided that you want to have a dabble at TT Gauge, if you're happy with accepting the scaled down range of buildings, then you're going to be fine. But if you want something a little different, then you're going to have to venture into the world of scratch building. I've built a depot. Come see how I did it.
One of the main problems British TT is suffering at the moment is obviously a lack of buildings. So there's going to have to be a lot of scratch building on this layout. I'm not afraid of scratch building, as you can see, I've done it before. But to get an idea of what I'm going to be doing and the idea of size, particularly as I've never worked in this cage before, I've knocked up a cardboard mock of the depot building I'm going to have on the TMD. Now this is just made from cereal packet, as you can see, and it just gives me a rough idea of how I want it to look. Now, I've had a look at various depot buildings. There aren't many around these days, so I've sort of combined looks, and this is roughly based on Roberts Road in Doncaster and on the Freightliner depot at Southampton. So we've got the main door here, the locos going for servicing, a slightly smaller door here for vehicle access, and then on the side there's a Wagon repair workshop, and this allows the layout to have a bit more variety in what's going on rather than just logos coming in and out. So to make the actual model, I'm going to be using the same method I did with my small panel build, and that is using mount board as the main structure. So that'll be cut out into the required shape and then clad in Plasticard afterwards, as I have done with this build.
Using the same dimensions I had for the cereal packet mock-up, I marked out the dimensions on the mount card before cutting out the shell. I then glued all the pieces together to make the main basis of the depot. Now when I scratch build, I do like to make the interiors, and I do like to make them as detailed as possible. I cut out the floors and made 2 sets of steps. I used 2 different methods to the steps. One block, as you can see, is just various sizes of cardboard all glued together, and the other one is in more of a step design. Once the floors and walls were cut out, I glued them all together to make the office interior itself. Upstairs would consist of 2 offices, a mess room with kitchen, and a small cleaner's cupboard. Downstairs would have a small entrance area where the lockers would be kept, toilets and showers in the block in the middle, and then a stores on the other side. With the main base of the walls done, I then moved on to the tedious task of painting the stairs. This was a very awkward operation and completely pointless if truth be told, because you can't see the stairs now the model is complete. To put glazing into the kitchen window and office windows, I cut out some acetate to the same size as the walls and then used some thinner card cut to the same shape with the door cut out to represent the other side of the wall. I then glued it all together, painted in matching colours to the other walls, having the doors red and the flooring blue, and then used microstrip to finish off, making the skirting boards, door frames and window frames. With the walls complete, I moved on to the kitchen interior. This was made up with a mix of cardboard and plastistrut. The plastistrut was used to form the kitchen cupboards and the oven, and then a thin layer of cardboard was put on top to represent the kitchen worktops. The seating came from a model scene bus kit which I adapted to represent sofas. I added some figures to the scene as well. The figures are actually 00 scale, but I didn't think it would matter too much because I thought they'd only be seen through the windows. However, I later decided to remove the woman at the door because it was quite obvious that she was oversized. Everyone else sitting down I thought I could get away with. I made extra pieces like computers, there's a printer, a bookcase. The tables came from an old Kitmaster coach kit, and here's a close-up of that interior. The majority of it is all scratch built, the exception being the filing cabinet, which is actually a West Hill Wagon Works 3D print. This is a close-up of the mess, and you can just see I've just used scraps from my scrap box to represent things like the kettle and toaster, etc. One of the key things I find with scratch building is not to dive in and glue everything all together at once, and it's also a good idea to work modular. As you can see here, all the components are separately fitted, and this allows me to work on one section at a time. With the upstairs done, I moved on to downstairs. I'd already done a little bit whilst working on the upstairs. The floor been painted, tiles drawn in, and I used a microstrip again to represent door frames and skirtings. Microstrip is really useful for making sure that things look nice, clean and tidy. Added detail to downstairs would include some TT scale figures and some other TT scale bits from West Hill Wagon Works. I primed them up ready for painting and adding to the model. As well as the toilets and showers downstairs, I needed somewhere for storage, and so therefore I built these racks. They are built using Plasticard N-scale ladders, with a little bit of microstrip just to represent the bracing. With the racks built, I painted them and then added a few detail parts from my scrap box. On the other side of the toilets and showers, I added some lockers, and I even put a notice board up between the two doors. Here's a more detailed view of the racks, with mostly old Airfix kit parts on it. And that was the downstairs area complete, but as you can see, all that lovely detail is lost into the shadows, so therefore I decided to install some lighting. Using a roll of LEDs, I cut the strips off into the threes that they come as, and placed them at various points along the ceiling. I then wired it up, and to cover it all, I made a cardboard base, just to tidy everything away. The only thing I forgot to consider was the toilet block, which meant that the ceiling card that I had just made would need to be adapted a little bit later. Next up would be what is probably the depot's most important part, the inspection pit. I cut a piece of TT track to size and worked out roughly how big I wanted to make the pit. This would all be done on a cardboard base. With no current Pico inspection pit kits available in the TT range by Pico, I would have to scratch build my own, and so I did this by cutting away the sleepers in between the rails and then cutting the card to size for the inspection pit, leaving two pieces of card in the middle which would represent walkways to add strength. With that all cut out, I then added the card round the sides to represent a more smoother work surface for people to work on, but they were still at a slight angle. I thought I'd be okay with this, but I would change my mind later on. With the card all applied, I then added a base coat of grey primer. With the flooring done, I then moved on to the supporting framework for the main building. This is all made up with Plasticard, and it's not quite prototypical, but I felt that it looked right, and so I was happy with that. If I was to do it again, I probably wouldn't build it in the same way I had. But once it was all glued together, I again added some lights, this time cutting the strips down so they were the thinnest size possible, so they weren't too exposed when on the model. Next job was the inspection pit itself. This was made from cardboard, and using the Pico steps from the gauge inspection kit, which I cut down to size, I also made holes in the inspection pit so that lights could be added. Again, I used the strip lights I've been used on the rest of the model and sealed them in using glue and glaze glue. Now prototypically the lights should be in the side of the wall, but the scale meant that this just wasn't possible, so I put them in the floor. I don't think it matters too much because once it lights up it's quite an impressive effect, and the fact that the depot is going to surround it and you're not really going to be able to see in the inspection pit, I felt it didn't matter too much. As you can see here, I tested the lighting to make sure all was working well before moving on to the next part of the build. I then decided to weather the floor. I used mostly washes to get this effect with a little bit of weathering paints, mostly along the lines of dirty grease. The inspection pit was also given a weathering, and this was made quite grubby because I felt this was where any oil spills etc. is really going to be. It's sort of where the heavy maintenance is done. And that was the interior of the building pretty much done. I went round and I weathered the rest of it. You can see the markings on the wall where people's grubby overalls have rubbed against it. And although it's not very evident here, I gave the ironwork a neutral grey wash just to tone it down a bit. Overall, I was pleased with the final result, until I discovered a photo. A Google search brought up an interior shot of Roberts Road Depot, and I realised that I had done my depot in a far too 1960s style interior rather than today's more modern, clean interior depot. I also wasn't happy with the sloping floor, so the inspection pit came out, the cardboard came off, and I corrected it so that the whole track was level. Once that was done, I then painted it in the same fashion as I'd seen in the photo I'd found in my Google search. The finish being dramatically different to my first attempt. There's a green painted walkway, chevroned area to warn staff of the impending doom of falling in the pit, and the 4 orange areas where I would put some lifting jacks. The ironwork was also repainted grey. One of the problems I met along the way of building this depot was the decision to use mount board as the main construction. Now, I had previously used it in my build of Swindon panel, and it came out quite well. However, the difference here was with Swindon panel, I used the mount board to build the main base of the structure, but the interior rooms were built as a separate entity, so therefore the walls were never exposed. In this instance, some of the walls were being exposed and they required painting, and that resulted in quite the disaster because I couldn't quite get the colour right. I got impatient with the paint and basically the card became saturated, bent out of shape, and it was completely unusable. I could make it again out of card, but I decided to go plastic all the way. And so I went to my second attempt of building the shell for the depot, this time using 30 foul plastic for the exterior body. With all the parts then cut out of the Plasticard, I then moved on to doing the exterior cladding. It's a lot easier to mark out the shape whilst everything was in separate pieces rather than when it was glued together. I could get windows and door markings on the sheet. I would use some Slater's corrugated sheet. This is for 3mm TT scale, but I felt the difference was minimal and so therefore suitable for the build. Looking at Roberts Road Depot on Google Earth, I noticed that the depot actually had a lot of skylights, and therefore my build would need slightly adapting to what was originally planned. As you can see here, by taping the 2 plastic sheets together, I could mark out the windows. Next job was to glue the shell together, using a little bit of tape just to hold everything in place whilst the glue set. Once the shell was complete, I then added the exterior cladding. Any glazing was sandwiched between the 2 pieces of plastic sheet. I used 3mm brick for the base of the model, and it's slightly larger than I need so that the depot can be embedded into the scenery. Where the side extension meets the main building, instead of using the cladding, I've actually used the 3mm brick wall all the way up to the ceiling. This is similar to what I found in the photo of the interior of Roberts Road. The interior walls and ceiling had microstrip added to represent ribbing. They also added microstrip around the doors to make some door frames. And finally some eye-bar Plastistruct was added to the interior of the extension. To finish things off on the build, I used microstrip all around the edging. This really tidied things up. I also used it to represent the guttering. I was really getting my money's worth out of the microstrip, as I also used it for the window frames. This was a very long and painstaking task, I am not going to lie, and I really wish I hadn't put skylights in that roof, but I'm glad I did. And although I tried my best to make sure the windows were equal size, everyone was slightly different, so each side had to be measured every single time. The main door interior frames also needed doing, and I used a C-type shape Plastistruct to represent the runners for roller doors. Here you can see the windows and the guttering closer up, and just above the window and below it is a few small pieces of plastic rod that I have added to represent extractor fans. Roberts Road Depot also has roof vents on it, which were between the skylights. I made this using plastic cards that I cut into a strip, then cut into squares and just filed into shape. I then used a smaller strip of plastic to cut into squares and glue underneath just to lift the vents up. Apply them to the roof next to the smaller windows, and I think the result is quite pleasing. Again, because it's TT Gauge, you can't always get everything you want, and I needed some lifting jacks. West Hill Wagon Works do them in N gauge and NOO, but not in TT. So I made my own. You can see here I've used the Hornby miling post markers as part of the build. They'd be the part of the lifting jack itself. Everything else was made of Plastistruct and other bits of plastic card. The build was finished off with a bit of plastic rod in the middle to represent where the jacks come up and down. I let the glue set before priming, painting and finally weathering the jacks, and then positioning them in place on the floor of the depot. With the exterior now complete, it was time to paint it. I used a mixture of Maskell and masking tape to protect the windows, inside and out, before priming the model. I've got to say the Maskell wasn't a great choice, and I wish I had just used masking tape on all the windows. Once primed, I decided to paint the exterior in a Revel Sky Grey colour. I thought I'd use it with airbrush, but the paint was absolute nightmare and clogged up in the brush only after doing one wall, so everything else was hand painted, including all the brickwork and all the weathering. The mortar lines were brought out by using a diluted life colour mortar coloured paint, followed by a natural grey wash. There was one final job left to do, and that was finishing off the Wagon repair shop, which went on the side of the depot. The base of the floor was made from mount board and some thinner cardboard in between, which was then sandwiched with some more mount board on top. This gave a nice smooth level surface for the workshop area. I did at one point during the build realise that I actually needed to bed the track into the build, and therefore had to cut the groove out of the card to allow the track to sit in between. Once I'd done this, I glued the track in and then cut some more card to represent the top surface before painting the entire thing and adding it to the depot. Of course, before I could fully add the floor, I needed to put some lighting in the Wagon repair workshop. And this was going to be a bit of a challenge because the wires couldn't go through the wall, again because of the modular construction of the way the depot was built. In the end, I added the lights to the ceiling, wired them up, and then used brass rod either side to represent conduit going down the sides of the walls to disguise the fact that the lights were wired up. You can also see that I've added roller shutters to each end of the doors. And this is the finished result. There's still a few little details to add, like limited clearance signs to the outside of the model, but otherwise it's done. It's taken me a lot longer than I expected, roughly around 3 months while I've been working on this project, in between other things, but still a lot longer than I expected. But I am happy with the results. I'm also very pleased with the detail and how it's come out. So I'll leave you to enjoy my depot. And that's how I built this depot. There's been a few hiccups along the way, particularly that one, but I got there. And it's taken me a little longer than I expected. I didn't think it would take me 3 months to build, but I do have a habit of just focusing on the tiny interior detail that no one is ever going to see, but I enjoy it. And that's the point of the hobby. So if you enjoyed this video, then please click the like button. If you want to see more, then click the subscribe button. And hopefully I'll see you again next time. Thanks for watching.